It was just past midnight on March 3rd, 1974, a Sunday, 8 minutes past midnight to be exact. The air was cold at London-Luton Airport. The crew of the Aer Turas Douglas DC-7CF was doing their job, a cargo flight from Dublin. 10 people on board, 10 people working. Landing a heavy Douglas from 1958 takes focus. Everything felt normal until the landing phase. Then, everything changed in a heartbeat. They were coming down to the runway, and suddenly, the flight became a fight for survival. How does a massive cargo plane crash without taking a single life? What goes through your mind when you realize the landing isn't going the way it should? Why do some moments turn into nightmares? I'm Captain James Harlow. I've spent 28 years in the cockpit, looking at the world from 30,000 feet. I've seen the best and worst of what happens up there. We're going to look at what really happened on that runway in London-Luton. We're going to talk about the Douglas DC-7CF, registered as EI-AWG, and how those 10 people walked away when the odds were against them. There's a story to tell about the people who made it out. Let me tell you who these people were and what they were flying that night. The Douglas DC-7CF was a workhorse of the sky. Built in 1958, it was designed for the long haul. This specific bird, registration EI-AWG, had a serial number of 45,471/965. It was a rugged machine. Aer Turas was relying on it to move cargo across the Irish Sea. These planes weren't new by 1974. They'd seen a lot of miles and a lot of heavy lifting. Keeping a plane from that era in the air requires mechanical respect. The crew was operating out of Dublin on a standard route, but the stakes are always high when you're hauling freight at midnight. The men in the cockpit were experienced professionals. They had to be. Flying a DC-7CF, a 4-engine piston aircraft, is a real handful. It's not like the automated jets we fly today. You have to be on top of every single engine and every single control surface all the time. It takes grit to fly these old cargo haulers. You have to be calm under pressure and know every sound the engines make. When one of those Wright R3350 engines hums differently, you hear it in your bones. There were exactly 10 people on board. 10 lives. 10 families waiting for them to come home. 10 people who'd spent their day loading and securing heavy crates. On a cargo plane, weight and balance are everything. If the load shifts, the plane handles like a brick. London-Luton is a busy airport. You have to be precise. With 10 people on board, they managed to walk away from a plane that ended up completely destroyed. That's a testament to something. Maybe luck, maybe skill, or maybe just the way the stars aligned that Sunday morning. Here's what nobody talks about when they look at the report, labeled as AAR 12/1975 by the AIB. They focus on the metal and the wreckage and the cause, but they miss the human element. These 10 people were flying a machine that was 16 years old. That's a lot of cycles for an airframe. The AIB spent a year and 5 months digging through the remains to figure out why the landing went wrong. That's a long time to look for answers in twisted metal. It tells you the investigation was thorough. It's a stark contrast to what was happening elsewhere that same day. The tragedy in France with the DC-10. That makes the outcome of this flight even harder to understand. 10 people, 0 fatalities, a total loss of the aircraft. It's a miracle that defies the usual logic of a crash. Picture the cockpit as they left Dublin behind. It was a cold night, the kind where the air feels thin and sharp. The crew was settled into their routine, checking gauges and keeping the 4 big piston engines humming. These men knew that aircraft like the back of their hands. They were climbing into the darkness, the Irish Sea stretching out below like ink. There was no hint of the chaos waiting for them at London-Luton. They were focused on the flight plan, the altitude, and the fuel mixture, the balance of gas and air the engines need to run smooth. Everything was textbook. As they approached the English coast, the conversation in the cockpit was professional and quiet. They were checking the weather reports for London-Luton, looking for any changes in wind or visibility. When you fly these old cargo planes, you're constantly listening for vibration or changes in the pitch of the props, those big spinning blades that pull the plane through the sky. They were clearing the way for their final descent, talking to air traffic control, and getting ready to bring that heavy load down to the tarmac. They were on track and on time. Then came the transition from cruise to landing. This is always the most demanding part of the job. You have to lower the landing gear and deploy the flaps, the movable parts on the wings that help the plane stay stable when flying slow. Everything started fine. They were aligned with the runway, the airport lights glowing in the distance like pearls. But something shifted. Maybe a mechanical problem, maybe the handling became unpredictable. In a split second, the feeling of control just slipped away. Think about what happens when the nose suddenly wants to go where you don't want it to. The pilots would have felt the yoke fight back. They were trying to hold the glide slope, that invisible path in the sky that leads straight to the touchdown zone. But the plane started to behave like a wild animal. They were fighting the controls, trying to keep the wings level while the ground got closer. 1 minute you're a professional pilot on a routine cargo haul, and the next, you're wrestling with a machine that feels like it has a mind of its own. They were in the final stage of the approach when it deteriorated. I've been there. You're looking through the windscreen, your heart beating against your ribs, your hands sweating on the controls. The crew would have been calling out airspeeds and altitude, checking every indicator to see if they could regain authority. They were pushing the throttles, trying to get enough lift to settle the plane down safely. But it wasn't responding the way it should. It felt heavy. It felt unresponsive. Then the realization hit. This wasn't going to be a normal landing. The tension in that cockpit must have been suffocating. They weren't just fighting physics, they were fighting time. They had only seconds to decide whether to continue or to pull up and try again. But as they got lower, the ground rushed up with terrifying speed. The pilots were likely braced for impact, their feet stomping on the pedals to keep the nose straight while they desperately tried to soften the landing. They were working in sync, knowing that the end of this flight would be anything but standard. Then came the final moments. The plane touched down hard. The structure groaned under the stress. Metal screeched against concrete. The sound must have been deafening, like a giant tearing paper. The plane began to slide, losing its grip on the pavement. The pilots were still trying to steer, still trying to keep the fuselage upright, but the momentum was too much. It was a blur of motion, a chaotic dance of steel and fuel, and then the world stopped. The silence that followed was probably the loudest thing they'd ever heard. The plane came to a stop, broken and battered. The cockpit was tilted, the cabin filled with the smell of hydraulic fluid and burnt rubber. The 10 people on board were thrust into shock. They had to move fast. They looked at each other, realizing they were alive despite the plane being completely destroyed. Not a single life lost. They scrambled to get out, pulling themselves through gaps in the wreckage, stepping onto the cold concrete in the middle of the night. Their gear was scattered, their cargo damaged, but their hearts were still beating. They looked back at the machine that had just carried them through a nightmare. The Douglas DC-7CF was a mess, a skeleton of its former self, torn apart by the force of the landing. It was a total loss, destined for the scrapyard. But for those 10 souls, it was the place where they cheated death. They stood there in the dark, breathing the cold air, probably unable to process what had just happened. They were bruised, shaken, and terrified, but alive. That's the truth of that night. That's the story of those 10 people. They walked away from a flight that should have ended in tragedy. Against all odds, they survived. And that's the only thing that really matters. The world outside the cockpit windows becomes a blur of gray and black as the Douglas DC-7CF begins its final, uncommanded descent. The pilots are holding those control yokes with everything they have, their knuckles white. Inside the cabin, the air feels heavy, pressurized by the sudden realization that the runway is no longer a path, but a target moving far too fast. There's this moment of absolute, terrifying stillness before the chaos starts. It's the sound of wind rushing past the airframe, a high-pitched whistle cutting through the engine hum. Then contact. It's not one thud, it's a violent, multi-stage shudder that vibrates through the aircraft's core. Imagine being inside a metal tube, suddenly trying to reshape itself against hard earth. The landing gear, those intricate systems of hydraulics and steel, groans under the immense weight and uneven forces. The plane skids, friction turning tire rubber into smoke and fire in a split second. The G-forces slam everyone forward, then sideways, as the fuselage fights the momentum. It's a sensory overload of grinding metal, the sharp scent of hot brakes, and the sudden, jarring halt as the plane tears into the ground. The cockpit becomes a whirlwind of flickering warning lights and desperate, frantic movements of men trying to maintain control over a dying machine. There's no time for complex recovery procedures or checklists. The plane is already reacting to physics, and the crew is just along for the ride, trying to keep the wings from dipping too far. There's a point where the pilot's hands are no longer flying the plane. They're just witnessing the slide. The flight path is dictated by the aircraft's energy and the uneven terrain at London-Luton. They might have tried to steer, might have tried to ease the impact, but the laws of motion have taken over. It's a brutal fight against gravity, and the plane is losing. The screech of metal tearing against the runway is constant, a deafening roar filling everyone's ears. They're braced, muscles locked, eyes fixed on the horizon spinning wildly. Then, forward progress stops. The sudden deceleration throws everything loose inside against the bulkheads. It's quiet for a fleeting second, the silence after the storm, before reality settles in. The engines have sputtered into silence, the lights flicker, and all that's left is the sound of their own ragged breathing in the dark. The first few minutes after stopping are a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Nobody moves at first, just listening to the groans of cooling metal. Then, training kicks in. They start checking on each other, their voices shaky but functional. They need to get out. The cabin, once a place of routine, is now a scene of debris and broken structure. They scramble toward emergency exits, ignoring their bruises and stinging pain. They're focused on one thing: getting clear of the wreckage before fuel lines ignite or the structure gives way. When they finally spill out onto the tarmac, the cold British night air hits them like a wall. They're standing there, huddled together in darkness, looking back at the silhouette of the plane that nearly claimed them all. It's surreal. The investigation team from the AIB arrives later, but in those first hours, it's just about survival. They're gathered by ground crew, blankets wrapped around their shoulders, shaking as adrenaline fades. They're talking to each other, recounting the last few seconds, trying to make sense of how they're still standing. Back home, families were waiting for a routine arrival, completely unaware their loved ones had just walked away from a total loss. The investigation would take over a year to pick through every rivet and wire. But for those 10 people, the only truth was that they could still see the stars above them. They were lucky, and they knew it. The long process of the official inquiry would eventually provide answers, but that night, the only truth was that they'd cheated death on a runway in England. First, the runway conditions. When a heavy bird like a Douglas DC-7CF touches down, it needs a specific amount of friction to stay straight. If the surface at London-Luton was slick, or if there was standing water, the massive weight of that plane becomes a liability. When you land a plane that old, you don't have the sophisticated anti-skid systems modern jets use to keep the wheels from locking up. If the tires lose their grip, the aircraft starts to slide like a hockey puck on ice. You're trying to steer with the nose wheel, but the plane is just sliding based on momentum. A perfectly executed approach can be undone in seconds by the runway's condition. It's a subtle trap. One moment you're in control, and the next, you're just a passenger in a machine sliding wherever physics wants to take it. Second, look at the mechanical state of the aircraft. This plane was built in 1958, which means by 1974 it had been through a lot. We're talking about 16 years of heavy cargo work, and that takes a toll on internal components. Specifically, the control linkages, the cables and rods that connect the yoke to the flaps and rudder. If one cable stretches, snaps, or gets stuck, the pilot is fighting a losing battle. You can push the yoke hard, but if the signal isn't getting to the wings, the plane won't listen. It's like driving a car where the steering wheel is disconnected from the tires. You're turning, but the car goes straight. It's a nightmare for any pilot, and it explains why the crew felt like the plane had a mind of its own during that final landing. Third, the human factor in a multi-engine piston aircraft. Operating a DC-7CF isn't like flying a modern plane with a computer. You have 4 separate engines, and each needs perfect synchronization with the others to keep the plane balanced. If one engine loses power, or if the propeller pitch is off, the plane naturally wants to pull to one side. You have to be physically active on the controls, constantly adjusting power and trim. If the crew was dealing with an engine issue or sudden power loss during final descent, It required an immediate, perfect reaction. If you're tired or the workload is too high, it's easy to miss a small indicator. That split-second delay in reacting to a power imbalance can turn a routine landing into a disaster. These men were professionals, but they were human. When you're flying a machine that requires that much manual input, the margin for error is razor thin. If the plane deviates from the glide slope, you have to catch it right away. Miss that moment, and you're playing catch-up for the rest of the flight. As we saw that night, sometimes you just run out of runway. It's the harsh reality of aviation, especially with older birds. You're always one heartbeat away from losing it all. That's exactly why the AIB took over a year to finish their report. They needed to find that specific point where the human, the machine, and the environment collided. It's not just one mistake, it's how those factors stack up. When the AIB released that final report, number AAR 12/1975, they were looking at why a sturdy machine like that Douglas DC-7CF ended up as a total write-off. One of the direct results was a much tighter focus on how these older, heavy cargo haulers were maintained, especially the linkages controlling the flight surfaces. After this event, inspectors started paying closer attention to wear and tear on the cables connecting the cockpit to the wings. It wasn't just about replacing parts anymore. It was about checking for hidden stress built up over 16 years of flying. They implemented new, more frequent inspection cycles for these older aircraft, ensuring every rod and cable could handle the tension required for a safe touchdown. It changed how crews looked at pre-flight checklists. They stopped assuming the plane would act the same way it did yesterday. They started looking for small, subtle signs of metal fatigue that could lead to loss of control on the runway. Beyond mechanical checks, this accident pushed the industry to rethink how they trained crews for emergencies during landing. Before this, many pilots weren't fully prepared for how a heavy, unbalanced cargo plane behaves if it touches down with a slight mechanical glitch. The investigation led to better simulator training scenarios that specifically mimicked how a plane pulls or slides when the landing gear is under extreme pressure. It was about teaching pilots to expect the unexpected and react with their feet and hands before momentum took over. They started emphasizing that when you're on the runway, you're still flying the plane until it's parked. It was a direct response to those 10 people. The AIB made sure the industry learned that every landing is high stakes, no matter how routine the flight path seems. It was a wake-up call for everyone operating these aging piston engine workhorses. I spend a lot of time thinking about those 10 people. They went to work on a Sunday night, expecting to land, unload, and go home. They were just 10 people doing their jobs. And there they are, standing on the dark tarmac at London-Luton, looking at their plane in pieces, realizing they're the lucky ones. It makes you realize how thin the line is between a normal day and a complete nightmare. I'm just a guy who spent his life in the sky, and I know luck plays a part. I run this channel on my own, and it's the support from people like you that keeps these stories from being forgotten. If you found this story interesting, hit the like button. It's free and only takes a couple seconds, and it tells YouTube that these stories matter. If you want to help me keep digging into these old reports and bringing these accounts to light, consider joining as a member or making a small donation. It's a small, independent operation, and every bit of support goes directly into researching these accidents so we can tell the truth about what happened. I really want to know what you think about this one. Do you think those pilots had any chance of saving that plane once it hit the runway, or was it already too far gone the moment it touched down? Leave a comment below. I read as many as I can, and it helps me understand what you want to hear more about. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.